argue that most people aren't like me, in that I often wonder if the people in my small apartment complex even know I exist. And it's not in the, hey, notice me, why isn't anyone talking to me kind of way, although actually that does happen. But I'm more thinking in the I'm so isolated, I never really exit my apartment kind of way. Pretty certain that people, if they get a glimpse of me, think I'm a visitor. Anyways, if this were, say, the early 90s, or hell, maybe even the early 1900s, I wouldn't know about the protests, the civil unrest. I may not even know that there's an airborne pandemic on a nationwide tour. However, technology has kept me in the loop. But say there is no technology that I have no access to. I may just be finding out right now via this video, providing that it didn't cause a colossal time disturbance or something like that people are getting sick and dying from a virus that is very easy to transmit from person to person. Perhaps in newspaper form, it'll work out. So I grab the motion picture newspaper and see the headline, "There's a pandemic sweeping the globe." And then I promptly set the motion picture paper down, turn around, and go back into my apartment, pretending like I know nothing, because that's really the easiest way to deal with this if one is quite lazy. But none of this is the case. I'm only lazy some of the time, and as most will say, in order to justify yet another horrifying event taking place, it's 2020. So I already knew about the pandemic, and that means I kind of gotta address it. Well, actually not the virus, but a really odd behavior centered around it. That being, ignoring expert advice that will actually help prevent it from spreading to others. Instead, some have chosen to listen to someone in authority who knows nothing about pandemics, viruses, or actually anything else for that matter. So I'm here to answer a simple question. Why are people listening to the United States president, who has continued to conduct rallies resulting in at least 700 deaths from this virus, instead of listening to the experts? The experts say all we need to do are relatively simple modifications. Wash your hands thoroughly, stay at home. If you need to go out, try your best to social distance, and wear a mask. Like this. See? Pretty easy. These things will help prevent further spread or cases, thereby reducing the number of deaths. While this behavior of loyal obedience, despite the harm the virus could cause to the self or others, appear to be perplexing, I think it may be more simple than we realize. Do I have any studies about the current phenomenon taking place? No. Now hold on. Stay with me here. I want to conduct a simple exercise with you. Let's do some hypothesis building so that social scientists can pick up the torch and test this for themselves, so we at least can have a better understanding of what actually may be taking place. Let's sit down and explore together one avenue researchers can take, that being the road of destructive obedience. As mentioned, not a lot is known about this easily transmittable virus, but what is known is that you can actually decrease the likelihood of it spreading by taking very extremely basic measures, like, again, thoroughly washing your hands, social distancing, that means avoiding kind of personal contact with others, and most importantly, wearing a mask. Now, this last measure seems to be the easiest one to practice, but also it is the most visible measure to undertake. Because it's 2020, there's an uncomfortably large number of people who absolutely refuse to do this, what I would say, simple thing. I've seen things on social media of angry people screaming and intentionally coughing on children, older people, and disabled people in a bizarre act of what appears to be defiance. Human behavior can be contradictory. However, most of the time, even if the behavior seems odd, it's generally traceable to something that makes sense within the human experience, the need to survive. That's why it's interesting that some people aren't willing to alter a little bit of how they navigate their environment, thereby risking their lives and lives of others just because a single individual instructed them to completely disregard the pandemic. This includes not wearing masks or doing anything else to protect themselves and their communities. It's sadly fascinating because they're essentially obeying an order to cause harm to themselves and society. A single individual is eliciting an emotional response, anger, within their followers that is overriding their will to survive. This is generally the one time where they actually should be fearful, but they follow the wrong emotion. There are a few things that helped create this maladaptive, arguably antisocial behavior centered around masks that I believe are serious societal problems existing outside of any one individual. And we may actually explore this later, but first, to really understand the situation, we have to dig into the chain of events. Initially, when the virus was spreading, heads of states worldwide were informed early about the virus, what it does, and how to help prevent it from spreading. Now, some countries implemented measures to curtail the spread. However, Donald Trump, the United States president, leaned heavily towards a conspiracy theory, suggesting that the virus was simply a hoax by the Chinese government and the Marxist left.
The coronavirus, you know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax.
Implying, if not outright claiming, that there was no need to wear a mask, because doing so would obviously signal to others that a communist was underneath the mask. In doing this, the president marketed the idea that wearing masks were the equivalent to accepting tyranny. This idea he promoted was contrary to the evidence that was readily available, and it was only about a month ago that he admitted to having lied to the public on behalf of the stock market. Regardless of the submission, the damage was already done. This lie ended up making wearing a mask and social distancing a partisan issue instead of a public health issue. I'm having a difficult time believing that anyone really took the president at his word about it being a hoax, minus maybe a tiny fraction of the population. We all are fully aware that if the man is breathing, or even struggling to breathe, he's probably telling a lie. The only difference there are among people regarding his lack of truth-telling is that some people are bothered by his lies, while others just aren't. Lack of action, partisanizing of the issue, and creating intentional confusion of the truth caused the United States much more loss of life and suffering per capita than other similar countries. And now, in the United States alone, there have been around 230,000 deaths, a death toll that shows no sign of slowing down. There are numerous Trump voters and supporters who knew that Trump's position was untrue, but still took no precautions in preventing the spread of the virus. In doing so, these supporters were virtue signaling to others that they stand with their president. Regardless if you actually believe that people genuinely bought his lies or not, the end result is the same. Thousands of people in the United States no longer exist and will never exist again. There are some amount of people who have died from this that may not be dead had we taken the proper measures as a nation, and that should matter to everyone. Now, I want you to start thinking of an answer to the main question the video wants to answer. That being, if one's actions to show loyalty to Trump results in the death of a loved one or anyone, does virtue signaling to one's in-group and following Trump's lead absolve followers of any wrongdoing? What level of responsibility does each member of society have in assuring that they don't kill other members of that society? While we're thinking of answers to these questions, let's turn our attention to ways in which we may be influenced by others to behave a certain way or do certain things. A concept shockingly called social influence. What I mean by social influence includes any changes in beliefs, attitudes, and/or behaviors through interactions with or exposure to others. There are three major ways in which we are influenced by our social world. The first is through conformity. That is basically doing what others do. This may be akin to something like dressing like others because others dress like others. I think I've done an episode on conformity. If I have, I'll link it below, and it'll be shown as a click bar somewhere above my head, maybe here. To be perfectly honest, I actually don't remember. Okay, don't look at me that way. I'm human. Another way influence from others is understood is through compliance. That is doing or behaving a certain way at the request of peers. Think of this as the more egalitarian way in which social influences can take place. Because, as peers, everyone is on the same social level. So, for example, as your peer, I may ask you to do me a favor by supporting me for less than a single cup of coffee via Patreon. This request for support is a very directed, explicit request. But requests can also be implied, like expectations centered around reciprocity, such as exchanging gifts. Okay, so the third and final way in which social influence takes place is by what our focus is on today, obedience. So if compliance is the more egalitarian form of social influence, obedience is the more hierarchical form of social influence. It's being influenced by an authority figure or someone who holds power over you to do something or behave in certain ways. Hypothetically speaking, this may be like failing to take appropriate measures or precautions that will protect the self and others during, let's say, a pandemic of some kind, at the behest of someone like the president, someone who's in a position of authority. How much one obeys someone in authority depends on the extent to which group members view the legitimacy of that person within that position. This relationship may be maintained in several different ways. Typically, these ways are centered around power dynamics, but attribution of authority is essential, and this may be processed at 3 levels. The first is system level, and where authority relationships reside. It's whether or not the system is legitimate. Think of voting in a democracy. Is the system of voting legitimate? The legitimacy of a system of voting is aided by transparency, because its absence signals to those who participate that there may be corruption embedded within it. Thus, the system itself runs the risk of being viewed as illegitimate. The second is the legitimacy of the authority itself and its appearance. Think of this one as not only understanding why authority relationships take place, but also if a person in authority is worthy of that placement. As an example, think of someone who inherited a massive amount of wealth. Because a society's priorities can be questionable, where there's an inheritance of wealth, there's an inheritance of power. This is why heirs are often viewed with contempt. They aren't seen as being worthy of their station. They're illegitimate. The last part of legitimizing authority is at the level of demands. View this one as what the authority figure is asking of their subordinates. Is it perceived as a reasonable ask? These levels can be subjective, and not everyone's going to agree on the legitimacy of authority at every level. But for those who do agree, they will give the person in authority the right to make demands and regulate behaviors of subordinates. I want to focus on this last level a bit more and its relationship with obeying. Can someone obey a request they view to be illegitimate? Some may tell you that indeed there are situations that produce obedience regardless of how ethical the request seems to the obeying subordinate. A situation can override the legitimacy of the request. This understanding comes from a seminal or strongly influential experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram. Now, I know that every psychology student, teacher, and hobbyist knows exactly what this experiment is with the mention of Milgram's name alone. And that really goes to show you how influential this study was and continues to be. For this study, Milgram recruited adults to participate. The recruits were told that they were participating in a study investigating the impact of punishment on learning. With each study participant was a researcher and a confederate. Now, in this context, a confederate is someone working with a researcher who knows everything about the experiment, but pretends as if they're as naive as volunteers who know nothing about the experiment. Recruits were told that they would be randomly assigned to the position of teacher or learner, but recruits were always teachers, and confederates, whom again participants believed were also study participants, were always learners. The teacher, the study participant, was instructed to read a list of adjective-noun pairings that the learner was to memorize. During the testing phase, the teacher read an adjective followed by 4 nouns, and the learner was to say which noun was originally paired with the adjective. If the learner made a mistake, they were to be punished by receiving a shock of increasing intensity with each mistake, starting at 15 volts to a maximum of 450 volts. The teacher was to administer the shocks to the Confederate. These shocks didn't really exist and definitely weren't actually being administered to the Confederate. But when the button was pressed to administer the shock, the Confederate acted as if they were being shocked by yelling as if in pain from the room next door, loudly enough so that the recruit could hear these screams. Despite protests from the Confederate, 2/3 of study recruits obeyed the researcher by continuing to administer the shocks, all the way to the highest level possible. This finding was unexpected. A majority of participants continued the experiment while even knowing they were hurting another individual. And even though Confederates weren't actually in pain, recruited study volunteers didn't know this. As an aside, this study has been conducted all over the world, and results hold consistent across cultures and can be seen in multiple areas like the workplace. Now, this isn't exactly the same phenomenon we're seeing today, right? I mean, the people who don't wear masks while knowing they are putting themselves and others at risk of, at worst, death, which is actually a serious consequence, they don't have someone standing over them monitoring their behavior. They also don't have explicit instructions to engage in this risky behavior. Oh, and another thing, even though most study participants expressed to the researcher their distress in administering the shocks, the people who don't wear masks, despite the risks, don't seem to really give a shit about the consequences of their behavior. A behavior, once again, that could result or lead to their death and or the death of others. So in other words, they show no signs of duress. In fact, they seem monstrously gleeful about it. Now, why would I even mention or bring up the Milgram study at all when it's so clearly not an apples-to-apples comparison between the conditions of the obedience experiment versus the conditions that are giving rise to engaging in risky behaviors by not wearing a mask during an airborne pandemic? Well, because we kind of have a real-life comparison between the two regarding this very situation centered around the behavior of failing to social distance and wear masks. Recently, Donald Trump contracted COVID during what has been termed the Rose Garden Massacre. This, of course, is a misnomer since it wasn't a true massacre. Well, despite this misnomer, it was a super spreader event. After which, attendees and people working close with the president stated that they, indeed, would have worn masks if the president didn't tell them directly not to do so. Other event participants said that they would have worn masks, but instead of being directed not to do so, they took no precautions to protect themselves and others because they felt pressured by the president. In this case, we are seeing both explicit and implicit communication from the president to avoid taking measures to keep each other safe. This massacre and the Milgram study highlight key aspects at play in this type of social control: power dynamics. The Milgram study relied on power due to expertise. The participants in the study understood that the study was conducted by someone who holds greater knowledge than they do. So, power that the researcher had over the participants was legitimized due to the authority seemingly having expertise. On the other hand, it's not hard to argue that the massacre didn't rely on this type of power. The Rose Garden situation most likely relied on aligned value orientation. When one's values do not align, social psychologists argue that subordinates are likely to disobey the authority's request. Now, both disobedience and obedience co-occur. So say that those closest to the president did disobey by defying the president via wearing protective masks. In this case, they agree with the legitimacy of the authority and the system in which the authority operates, but disagree with the request and consider the request to be illegitimate. So it's the legitimacy of the question, not the authority, that is being evaluated. And that evaluation occurs based on values. In this example, we can see how obedience and disobedience occur together. The subordinates are disobeying the authority by staying true to their values. They're essentially obeying their values. In this alternate reality, where the president was defied by his closest advisors, we would probably see a more healthy relationship between subordinate and authority if values were prioritized by subordinates. But here's the thing. They don't have any values outside of believing in power and doing everything possible to obtain it. Regardless, the important thing to consider is that this relationship between Trump and his direct subordinates can be viewed through a very similar lens with which we view the Milgram study. But when we expand to the entirety of the population at large, it kind of becomes more muddied. It's less clear as to what may be happening when people avoid precautions that could reduce the spread of an airborne disease at the implied recommendation of the US president. Will private citizens do something that hurts others because a public official made an implicit request? In this, it's a they asked without asking type of thing. In undergraduate, I took a criminology class, and the professor was a great storyteller. He was from Germany, but he seemed to know more about how power is distributed within the United States better than most people from the US. Whenever he would finish telling a story that would answer whatever question he posed, he would say, "The long and the short of it is." I had never heard that term before, and it really stuck with me. So, in regards to whether a private citizen can do something that hurts others because a public official made an implicit request, the long and the short of it is yes. People don't need to be in close proximity and receive overt instructions from an authority figure in order to cause harm to others. Under these circumstances, motivation may play an essential role in why people obey. What researchers find is that people who obey aren't necessarily automatons, automatically obeying without much thought behind what's being asked of them. They decide whether the request is reasonable, and where it's not reasonable, if they believe in the overall mission, they'll obey and do what's being asked. What may be behind destructive obedience is whether or not people more closely identify with the person in authority or the person who's the target of the authority, that being the person being harmed. So as long as the mission seems worthy, then the request is carried out, despite the unacceptability of the request. This may be why some are obeying the president by putting people at risk, and obviously inadvertently putting themselves at risk. But not everyone is neglecting health-saving measures. Not everyone is obeying. This leads us to explore if individual differences exist that may account for why some refuse to comply with the demand of an authority figure. There is evidence that supports that individual differences may matter regarding destructive obedience. Several studies have looked at the relationship between obeying in a Milgram or Milgram-like experiment and individual characteristics such as personality or political ideology. The Milgram study was designed to show how a situation may create monsters out of any and everyone. There may be a combination of both situation and individual characteristics that may influence who disobeys or who obeys. Studies have shown that there's an increase in destructive obedience when someone is, or at least feels like they are, socially isolated, another situational factor. But only accounting for the situation creates a very binary way of viewing behavior. Either you do a behavior or you don't. It doesn't help explain why someone disobeys while others obey. The concept that the situation is the only driving force behind obedience, harmful or otherwise, doesn't really consider something like the degree to which one is willing to behave a certain way. Take this as an example. Consider you're in a hurry to get to a perfectly safe, socially distanced, mask-wearing public outdoor event. But in a rush, you accidentally leave your mask on the kitchen counter. Upon arriving at the event, several people aren't wearing masks. Now, contrast this scenario with the behavior of happily not wearing a mask while in public, because the president said it's fine. For an observer, the two situations appear to come from the same mindset. After all, both people are at the event without a mask. Similar observable behavior, but different motivations. Severe consequences, like death of the self or others, may be what happens in both cases. But the underlying behaviors that resulted in going buck maskless are completely different. One is born out of forgiveness, while the other, most likely out of a sense of duty and or malice. When someone knowingly neglects their responsibility to society, in this case, failing to protect friends, family members, co-workers, and the community at large from contracting something that has placed death upon others, I can't help but come to the conclusion that this neglect is nothing less than an act of hate toward your fellow neighbors and other members of your community. Personally, I would think that a certain kind of person would behave this way. And I may not be wrong. For instance, researchers have found a relationship between neuroticism and destructive obedience. Neuroticism is a personality trait measured in popular personality tests and represents one's ability to handle social threats, such as rejection. What researchers found is that having low neuroticism in combination with high negative affect or emotional distress was associated with a greater reluctance to engage in destructive obedience. Basically, these study participants were more hesitant with engaging in a destructive obedience task. The researchers believe that this combination of personality traits may be indicative of empathy, but what exactly it suggests is still up for debate. Now here's where the research gets even more interesting. Studies show that those high in right-wing authoritarianism are more likely to engage in destructive obedience. But one thing that may be able to decrease the likelihood of destructive obedience in authoritarians is self-regulation fatigue. Basically, for right-wing authoritarians, if they are stretched thin on an energy, thinking, and or emotional level, they're less likely to engage in destructive obedience. So in this group that's more likely to engage in destructive obedience, it's a controlled process. It isn't automatic. As to whether or not authoritarianism represents a political philosophy or personality trait is anyone's guess. Nevertheless, political philosophy seems to play a role in disobedience. In a study from 2014, researchers found that individual traits in conscientiousness and agreeableness may impact how much one obeys. However, those who were considered as having a left-wing political ideology orientation were also associated with decreased destructive obedience. This was exceptionally true for women on the left, who were willing to engage in so-called rebellious political activism, such as going on strike. Interestingly, the authors of this study noted, although our research suggests that adaptive traits in the interpersonal domain may be maladaptive in a context involving destructive authority, they also suggest that some behaviors that may disrupt social functioning, such as political activism, may express and even strengthen individual dispositions that are both useful and essential for the whole of society. So in other words, activist leftists, your contributions to society aren't lost on others. And also, do you see how much I help weed through the information so it's better understood by everybody? Thank you. You're welcome. I'm just kidding. While these studies were conducted in a lab using very particular constraints, some of these things, such as political ideology, may account for why some people wear masks and others don't. It may also suggest that high mask compliance will be seen in left-wingers, particularly women, while low mask-wearing compliance may be seen in those high in authoritarianism. It may be the case that those high in authoritarianism are engaging in destructive obedience with effort. Self-regulatory fatigue may occur if these individuals either get sick themselves or witness the illnesses impact on a loved one. In turn, this would likely decrease or even stop engaging in this type of negligent behavior. This is probably why people like me often say that certain members of society will only understand certain events that involve things like empathy, if they themselves experience the event personally. While this touches upon the people within society, it doesn't consider the context in which the destructive obedience takes place. After all, we don't exist in a vacuum, and our existence didn't just happen for the first time this year. So we should consider placing behaviors like this within social, political, and historical contexts to better understand why portions of society can produce anti-society sentiment. Without getting too much into the weeds here, I think it's fair to say that the push towards right-wing extremism from since I was even born will probably account for, at minimum, the acceptance of this type of behavior. This push was motivated by wealthy individuals who gained to benefit from presenting all sides as equally legitimate. Newsflash, they're not. Nowhere is this problem more clear than in the debate centered around climate change. We really shouldn't even have a debate to begin with, because there was not and never was a 50-50 split of scientific consensus centered around this issue. But the oil companies want you to believe otherwise. As the US president admitted, he lied about the seriousness of this pandemic in order to give GOP donors the ability to profit off the suffering of the American people. But this was able to take place because of years of building a toxic foundation in the American political system and discourse. A toxicity that, no doubt, has influenced thoughts and behaviors of the citizenry. This foundation was created early in the American experiment and was worsened during the 1970s and 1980s as a backlash to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Americans have needlessly died and will continue to do so because of propaganda that has made clear that priority is given to the monetary system over the social system and over human life. I don't know if this is reversible, but I don't think society can effectively function when societal priorities are so misplaced. Now, I want to return to the question I posed at the beginning. So on one hand, propaganda is such a powerful tool because it's effective. On the other hand, nearly 230,000 American lives are gone. On one hand, the pushers of these lies are yet to be held accountable. On the other hand, we have people gleefully coughing on the elderly in order to own the libs. This behavioral negligence has been conducted by those who believe in personal responsibility. Under that belief, these nefarious actors should absolutely be held responsible for their behavior. They've literally killed others. So if we just simply defer to the belief system of those who have participated in this type of destructive behavior, then they should absolutely be held responsible for their actions. But I'm kind of conflicted, so just leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Even though I can see a case for what may contribute to this type of carelessness, I still am having a really hard time understanding why anyone wouldn't sacrifice a little bit of convenience in order to assure the health and safety of other members within their society. Now, something that helps me feel at least a little bit better about this whole thing is that there may be some ways and even some people who just won't buy into the bullshit. So, left-wing activists, keep doing your thing. And don't forget to wash your hands, stay at home, but if you need to go out, practice social distancing and wear a mask. Alright, I'm going. Bye! Sorry, kiddo.